This is Zhee Zhou by Anara Guard. It was a Sunday, so Paris and London were at IHOP. London sawed his waffle across the equator and from the North Pole to the South. He cut along the grid until there were 36 pieces of waffle on his plastic plate. Then he dribbled a splotch of boysenberry syrup into each bit, thumbing the pitcher's handle shut after each pour. Paris smiled at him, admiring how he clicked the silver tab into place. Their father rolled his eyes and said, "You gonna eat that waffle, Lenny, or just decorate it?" He waggled his coffee cup in the air for the waitress to refill. "Don't call me that, my name is London." "Well, don't I know it," said their father with a little chuckle. "I was there when we named you, wasn't I?" Their parents had once dreamed of traveling to Europe. They had talked about bringing their firstborn child to the old cities, showing him Trafalgar Square, the Tower, 221B Baker Street. London sounded like a successful man, a banker or a stage actor. 11 months later, when their daughter was born, they named her after the most romantic place they could imagine, the City of Lights. London and Paris had been rocked to sleep with tales of their names. Their parents whispered it to them of the Left Bank and the Tate Museum, of castles and gardens they would someday explore. In the dark of the children's room, Big Ben and Notre Dame seemed almost within reach. So the children grew, but their parents grew weary. Dirty diapers and broken nights exhausted them. There were ear infections and outgrown shoes. The car's timing belt failed. They moved to a cheaper apartment, tossing out the colorful travel guides they had collected. But the checking account still didn't balance, and the grown-ups' voices were loud late at night. One day the parents said it was time to move again. Their father said the new place was small and only fit 3 people. Their mother said that Daddy had agreed to make more room by moving out. Paris cried. She said she would stop eating so she wouldn't grow any bigger, but they told her, "Don't be silly." London said that Daddy could have their room and the 2 kids could sleep on the couch, feet to feet. His mother sighed and twisted her mouth like she had on the day that the washing machine broke. She held her head and stared at the dirty water sloshing onto the floor. And that was that. On the very first day of school, the children were both age 6, so they were placed in the same classroom. At lunchtime, a chubby girl with bangs chopped too short across her forehead demanded, "Are you twins?" Paris shook her head no. In 2nd grade, Timothy chanted, "London's pants are falling down, falling down, falling down," as he yanked London's corduroys around his ankles. In 3rd grade, Timothy led a sing-song rhyme, "I see London, I see France, I see Frenchie's underpants." After that, everyone called Paris Frenchie. London and Paris sat together at lunch, played by themselves at recess. The other children regarded them as if they came from a far-off and unlikable country. Yesterday on the playground, Paul said he knew what French kissing was. He said a boy and girl touched their tongues together. London had pictured licking a tongue like a pink popsicle. "Hey, Frenchie must know how to French kiss," Ruth had leered at Paris. "Yeah," chimed Eddie. "Do you Frenchie kiss London when you see his underpants?" They whooped with laughter. Paris inched closer to London, but not too close. As they walked home, she said, "I think I know why they're so mean." "Yeah?" said London. He waited for her to explain. The sun glinted on her coppery hair. She frowned in the bright light. "Remember how everyone made fun of that girl from Africa? They don't like you if you're not from here. I think I really was born in Paris, and you were born in London." London nodded. He was pretty sure that they had been born in Fairview Hospital, but he didn't want to say so. It was a good idea for her to come up with a reason for the teasing and names. Otherwise, there had to be something wrong with them, like BO or being caught picking their noses. Or else there was no reason at all, and that thought made him dizzy with its awful emptiness. "I must know French," his sister said. "If only I could remember." They walked a little way in silence. "London?" Paris asked in a small, tight voice. "Do Englanders speak French?" He knew what worried her, the thought that the 2 of them might not speak the same language. "Oh yes," he nodded for emphasis. "They all learn French in school, because France is just across the water, and they go back and forth a lot." She smiled at him, her face lit with relief. "I thought so," and she began skipping. London thought about this while he ate his waffle, ignoring their father's glances. He wondered how he and Paris could feel like they came from somewhere else when they had never been anywhere. After brunch, it still wasn't time to go back to the apartment. Their father led them on a slow walk down 55th Street. Paris pointed out all the lines in the sidewalk. "Don't step on that crack, Daddy, you'll break your mother's back." Their father jumped across the crack as if it were a snake poised to bite him. She shrieked with delight. When they reached Hamilton's, both children stopped. "It's closed on Sunday," their father said. "We know," they chimed, pushing their foreheads against the glass. The shop window was crowded with toys, a Ferris wheel built from erector sets, tiny teddy bears, a red and black magnet shaped like a horseshoe. It even came with its own box of iron fillings. Paris elbowed her brother in the ribs and pointed. On the top shelf stood a dozen dolls, each in a different costume. There was a Dutch boy with wooden shoes and blue trousers holding a pail. A Japanese girl in a flowered kimono carried a paper pistol. And at the end, a doll whose red beret glowed in the dim light. A black velvet cape hung from her shoulders. The tips of shiny black shoes peeked from beneath her red petticoats. She pointed a tiny lace fan at them. London leaned his cheek against the cool glass to look at his sister. She was whispering softly, her eyes never leaving the French doll. "Lunny, Paris, catch up," their father called. Paris walked backwards away from the shop, still staring at the doll. London lingered for another moment, twisting his head to read the tag. $10. "Her name is Vivienne," Paris told him that night. They closed the door to their room and emptied their piggy banks onto the carpet. After stacking the coins into small towers, their merged fortune totaled $4.97. London looked at his sister. "I'm going to get you that doll. No more buying candy. We have to save every penny." She nodded in solemn agreement. He lay awake in the top bunk watching headlights sweep across the ceiling. Usually he would pretend to be a ship's lookout, hailing the lighthouse beams when they broke through the dark. But the weight of $5.03 threatened to pull the crow's nest from the mast. Paris sighed and mumbled in her sleep below him. "Every morning," she said, "don't forget my doll." And every morning he answered, "I won't." He rooted beneath the couch cushions for lost change and poked his fingers into the return slots of payphones. He begged his mother for extra chores to earn money. Once he spotted a quarter on the floor at IHOP. He waited for the waitress to walk past in her black rubber shoes, dropped his napkin, slid beneath the table, and grabbed the prize. "London," Paris called from the living room one afternoon. A black and white movie was on TV. White words glowed at the bottom of the screen. "They're speaking French. She keeps saying oui, and I know that means yes. Let's listen until I remember, then I'll be able to talk to Vivienne." They knelt on the couch facing away from the TV so they couldn't read the words. Paris dug her chin into the top of the cushions. London dangled his arms over the back like a chimpanzee. He closed his eyes and let the swooping sounds of Zhee and Zhou and Za run together like rainbow sorbet melting, filling his ears with possibilities. Did people who spoke like that walk like ice skaters, moving in circles and glides? Would they think he sounded like a caveman grunting and clucking? Every day after that, Paris clicked through the TV channels. If there was a French film on TV, she sat quite close to the screen, moving her mouth to match the shapes of the actors formed with their lips. In the buzzing light, her pale face gleamed like a fish in an aquarium, gaping ooh and boo and ah. Soon she began speaking the language. "C'est ça, frère London," she greeted him, bouncing on the edge of a lower bunk. "Dormez-vous?" Then she sang it so that he would understand. "No," he yawned, "I'm done dormaying." "Sunny Lonatina," she declared. "Time to go to la school, frère." And at last, school was over and the summer stretched before them like a railroad track reaching to the horizon and beyond. The children played in the small yard behind their building, with Mrs. Barnes keeping an eye on them from her kitchen when her mother was at work. If Paris shrieked too loudly, Mrs. Barnes would holler out the window, "You kids, pipe down!" At noon she yelled, "Go eat your lunch!" And they trooped inside where their mother had left bologna sandwiches for them. By the end of July, the coin towers were $9.46 high. Paris cleared a special spot on her shelf in preparation for Vivienne's arrival. She crammed pictures of French girls with black curls and red berets. London folded paper airplanes and practiced the loop-de-loop. "All right," said their mother, setting her pocketbook on the kitchen table next to them. "It's almost your birthday, Paris. I know you two have been saving hard. How much money do you need?" 54 cents, London replied without needing to subtract in his head. The brass clasp snapped open. "Give me what you saved, and tomorrow you can go to the store and get that doll." And she gave them a crisp green $10 bill. Just past the bush that always smells like cat pee, the children came upon a stranger sitting on a low concrete wall. Later, they could not agree how old he was. He might have been a grown-up, or maybe a teenager. Paris thought she remembered his tiny beard. London was sure his chin had been smooth. His skin was darker than theirs, lighter than Mr. Johnson's, the janitor in the building. He wore a green jacket and matching trousers, and sat with his legs crossed, swinging one foot back and forth as if he were admiring his loafer. London noticed that his ankles were bare. As the children came near, he looked up. His eyes were a startling light green. It gave him a faraway look as if he'd traveled across an ocean. "Did you hear what happened?" he said. London kept walking, but Paris halted in front of the man, so he stopped too. "Did you hear about it?" the man asked again when they failed to answer. His voice was low and earnest. London shrugged. It was hard to know how to answer a question like that. The stranger uncrossed his legs and stood, gazing over their heads up and down the street as if looking for someone. Then he sat down again and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He stared straight into Paris's face with his unsettling eyes. "There are thieves going around robbing people," he said. He spoke to them as if they were friends. 3 of them. They pushed people down and grabbed their money. One lady broke her wrist when she fell. Paris's eyes were round. London moved closer to her and glanced over his shoulder. The street was empty. "No one came up to you? You didn't see anything?" He spoke to London now in his gentle, urgent voice. Both children shook their heads. Paris sucked one of her fingers. "That's good." He smiled at them. The smile reached his eyes, shining with more light than before. "The police are looking for him. They'll probably catch him pretty soon. There goes a police car now." He pointed with a long finger to the end of the block. They turned their heads to look, but the black and white patrol car must have already turned the corner. London thought of tales in which a boy detective caught robbers and counterfeiters. "What do they look like?" His voice sounded thin and watery. "Good question," their friend said. He pulled out a packet of cigarettes, shook one out, and spoke while holding a match to its end, his mouth rigid around the words. "Tall, sunglasses, one of them has a checked hat, but you don't have to worry if you don't have anything for them to steal." A little breeze blew the smoke into his face so that he had to narrow his eyes. London admired how he didn't blink or fan the air in front of him. "You don't have any money, do you?" London shook his head, but Paris was nodding, a big, scared admission of their riches. They were all quiet for a moment. The breeze shifted the smoke. London could smell its harsh char. "Well," the man sighed, as if their disagreement disappointed them. "Where are you headed?" Paris pointed toward where the cop car had been. 55th Street, she said. He said, shaking his head. "That's right where they were." "We were going to Hamilton's?" London sounded as if the whole idea was in doubt now. The stranger looked over their heads again. "I think we can fool them," he confided in a low voice. The children moved closer to hear his idea. "I see you don't have a purse," he said to Paris. "Good thinking. Where do you keep your money?" London patted the front of his dungarees where their savings radiated like kryptonite. The man's green X-ray eyes locked on the spot. "Show me," he said softly. London pulled out the $10, holding on to it tightly, but the man made no effort to touch it. "They'll find it there, first place they'll look." London clutched the bill, uncertain whether to stuff it back in his unsafe pocket. "Tell you what," the man snapped his fingers on the last word. "You," he pointed at London with his cigarette, "hide it in her shoe." He stuck the cigarette back in his mouth and smiled at them. Paris had on her red party shoes, the ones she wasn't supposed to wear because she would scuff them. She wiggled her foot out without bothering to unbuckle first. London knelt on the ground before her like a knight waiting to be tapped with the sword. She held onto his head for balance, holding her bare foot off the grimy sidewalk, while London crumpled the bill into her shoe. Then she shoved her toes back in and began stepping on the back of the shoe the way their mother always told her not to, trying to force her heel in. "Not like that," their friend declared. "You'll get a blister." Paris leaned on London's head again. He held his neck steady to support her. He saw the man's hand reach toward the shiny red shoe and pull the money out. His long, dust-covered fingers smoothed the bill open, then folded it in halfway, the long way, giving it a nice crease down the center. Again it was folded, and twice more until it formed a compact little square. Into the shoe it went, his fingers poking a bit of paper into the tip of the toe. Paris hopped, jarring London's head. Their friend loosened the buckle, and on her shoe, she slipped her foot inside. London knew what she was thinking. Just like Cinderella. "Do you feel it rubbing your toes?" the man asked. Paris shook her head. "Try jumping around," he encouraged. She hopped twice. "It feels fine." She smiled, and he smiled back. "I don't think you'll have any trouble now," he said. He stood and dropped his cigarette on the ground. London thought the man would grind it out with his loafers, but he left it there, glowing red. You two be good, he said and walked away, back in the direction from which they had come. Bye, they called, but he didn't turn around. They walked the next 2 blocks quickly. Paris kept staring at her shoe and skipping with the left foot as if it were lighter than the other. London swatted her arm to make her quit drawing attention to her feet. He watched out for robbers and police cars chasing them. The streets were quiet. When they reached Hamilton's, they stopped at the window display. The dolls were as glorious as ever. Through the glass doors, they marched up to the counter where an old lady sat. She had poofy white hair, white eyebrows, pearly fingernails. London declared that they had come to buy the French doll. It cost $10, she said, frowning at them. The children nodded. They knew. She reached into the shop window to retrieve their prize. Paris bounced on her toes while the doll was swaddled in tissue paper. The old lady's bracelets jingled as she laid Vivienne into a blue cardboard box and slowly tied it with a long pink ribbon. London watched a 1 and 3 zeros pop into the little window of the cash register while Paris knelt down to retrieve their money. She stood up and turned her shoe over. Oops, she said, dropping the shoe on the counter. Wrong shoe. She stepped on the back of her right shoe with her bare left toes and pulled it off. She shook it with both hands, but nothing fell out. It was in your shoe, the old lady said. Yes, London's heart was thumping in his chest. He picked up the shoe, groping for what he knew would not be there. The clerk moved the box a little further away from them. He squatted down to check the other shoe, even though he knew it was the wrong one. He beat it against his hands as if that might make the money reappear. But the small, vanquished square was blocks away, fondled by the stranger's thin fingers. He stood up, feeling dazed. Paris was rigid beside him, tears oozing down her cheeks. Next time, don't forget your money, the old lady complained. Her white fingernails flashed as she untied the ribbon. London pushed the glass door open, dragging his sister out with him. The afternoon had turned hot and thick. Paris sobbed. She refused to put on her shoes. London clutched her damp wrist as he retraced their steps, scanning the sticky sidewalk all the way home. But he knew the $10 was gone. The doll was lost. Where's your new doll? Their mother asked at supper. London glanced at Paris, but she just kept mashing her meatloaf with her fork. We couldn't get it, he mumbled with his mouth full. We lost the money. He stared at the table so she couldn't see his eyes. You lost it? Their mother said. Oh, for God's sake, I thought you two were growing up. Wipe your mouth. Paris cried out in the middle of the night. London climbed down from his bunk and sat on the floor beside her, holding her hand. He knew she was dreaming of a green-eyed stranger. On her birthday, their mother gave Paris a red felt beret. Their father gave her roller skates that buckled over her shoes. London gave her a magic charm that he made out of Play-Doh and blue jay feathers. She put it beneath her pillow, but later, when he lifted the pillow to check, the charm was gone. Mrs. Reed pushed damp hair off her sweaty cheeks with the back of her hand so that the eraser she clutched wouldn't dust her round face with chalk. Fifth graders, I know it's hot today, but try to pay attention. Paris Montgomery, can you answer the question? Who did Sacagawea lead on their expedition to the west? Paris had propped her head on one hand, elbow on the desk, her gaze fixed on the stained ceiling tiles. London stared at her, trying to send a thought ray into her brain. Without changing her pose, she sighed in her most dramatic French accent. Louis and clock. Louis? Mrs. Reed said, like she hadn't heard right. Someone at the back of the classroom tittered. Paris dropped her hand on the desk and straightened her neck, gazing straight at the teacher. Oui, she said, moving her mouth as if Mrs. Reed needed to lip read to understand. Louis and Clark, they were the explorers. London held his breath. Kids were sniggering and pointing at Paris. Timothy laughed so hard he pounded his heels on the floor. Mrs. Reed's pink cheeks turned red and she thundered down the aisle and stood before Paris. Since you seem to think this is so funny, you can practice your accent in the principal's office. She smacked her chalky eraser on the desk, yanked Paris up by one arm, and marched her through the door. London stared at his sister's empty seat. One scuffed shoe lay beneath her desk, its toe pointed towards the windows as if it wanted to escape. He waited for her after school. When she came out, she tossed her head and smiled, but she didn't say a word. Every day after that, Paris found a new way to goad their teacher into red-faced reaction. She claimed she didn't understand English. She refused to take off her beret. She puffed on her pencil like it was a cigarette. The other kids enjoyed the daily drama, even after it became so routine that Paris stood up as soon as the teacher began heading towards her. Soon, Mrs. Reed merely pointed to the door, saying, "Detention," and Paris would saunter out. In the lunch line, Linda said, "Your sister is crazy," in admiring tones. London shrugged. How could he deny it? The next day, Linda gave Paris a handkerchief embroidered with 2 Scotty dogs. Some other girls invited her to jump rope at recess. Paris showed them how to kick their feet high in the air like can-can dancers. London leaned against the chain-link fence, feeling it press square shapes up and down his back. She shouted a word he couldn't understand. In cold afternoons, while Paris was kept after school, London waited in the library to read the encyclopedia. His favorite volume was L. He browsed lions, African, mountain, and extinct, lobster, liver, disgusting, lemurs and leopards, lemons, limericks, and London. He had always pictured growing up to be one of the tall, hatted royal guards there, or a knight in a castle, or a policeman at Scotland Yard, or the chimney sweep in Mary Poppins. Even when he pretended to be a cowboy, somehow rounding up cattle would be what he did during summer vacation. The rest of the year, he would live in a brick house on a cobblestone street with street lamps lit by a little man who carried the flame from post to post. Paris would live in an identical street just across that little strip of water labeled Channel on the map. He turned the page, its gilt edges gleaming in the shaded light, and there was another London, in Ontario, Canada. Population 55,750, home of the London Knights hockey team. The librarian looked up, sorting green due date cards. That book, he pointed to the table where the volume lay open, says there are 2 cities named London. Oh, there are more than that, she smiled. She knew his name from his library card, signed in wobbly letters back in 2nd grade. He gaped at her. Come with me. She led the way to the reference room. Her striped skirt was wrinkled in back. The lines crisscrossed each other like a crazy map, one that would be impossible to follow. With her hands, she lifted a large brown book from a stand. The book thumped upon the table as she laid it down. This is a gazetteer, she said. It's like an atlas, but without maps. All the names of places are listed in it A to Z. You can look up Chicago or New York or Philadelphia. She opened the book and demonstrated how to turn the big pages from the top corner. Let's look for New Haven, she said. Here's New Haven in Connecticut, of course, but there's also in Pennsylvania, and another in Iowa, and one in Colorado. London knelt on the bench and turned the pages from N backwards one by one. He traced his chubby finger down the columns just as she had done. And there it was, a dizzying line of possibilities. London, Kentucky, London, Connecticut, London, New York, 26 different Londons, and only one of them in England. The future was huge and uncertain. He might end up in London, Indiana, or New Zealand. A new thought gripped him. He flipped forward to P. At the top of the page, Paris, Arkansas, then Paris, Iowa, then Paris, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, Montana, New York, Ohio, and more. The letters ran together like a crazy version of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. He thought of Paris on the seesaw, her beret falling from her bright hair, a chubby girl weighing down the other end, holding her up in the air. London leaned across the gazetteer. He tore a small corner out of the page, crumpling the torn paper into his sweaty hand. He thudded the book shut. All done? Called the librarian. Yep, he said. He ran out of the library into the chilly afternoon. At the bottom of the stone steps, he squatted and loosened the laces on his sneaker. He pushed the scrap of paper bearing his sister's name deep into his shoe, into the warm, dark space where it would never be lost.